Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Demai chapter 5, Halacha 1. We're going to be talking about the procedure for tithing Demai bread. This is a complicated Mishnah and complicated Gemara because the principles and the assumptions are hard to grasp at the immediate point. So I'm going to tell you what the punchline is to make it very simple. The Mishnah looks like it's going to talk about the position of tithing Demai bread from the position of Bet Shammai. And that in itself would be very, very strange that it would be talking about the position of Bet Shammai as if this is a halacha. That's not really what's happening. It looks like it's a position of Bet Shammai. That's not really what's happening. There's another Mishnah that came up earlier that talks about challah, when you're baking bread the commercial baker's baking bread, they don't need to separate out challah. Now, that over there earlier, this is going to be in chapter 2 of Demai, was talking about a baker who is baking commercial bread in a state of tahara. He is a chaver baker. This case is going to be talking about the Amma Aretz baker, and the punchline is going to be not that the halacha is like Bet Shammai. It's not. It's going to be that the issue that comes up is that the bread is baked as tamei bread. And what we're ultimately going to get from Rabbi Yochanan is going to be that, look, if there is in this rabbinic rule bread that is made that is tamei, anyway, what's going to happen with the challah portion, you're going to take it out, you're going to give it to the cone's going to burn it. It's going to get burnt. So there's a few things that come up here. So they're taking, the punchline that Rabbi Yochanan's ultimately going to be saying is that they're going to be taking the portion out, and who's going to be taking out the portion? It's going to be the buyer. The buyer is going to be taking out the portions. Over there in Halacha 2, in chapter 2 in Demai, the chaver baker is going to separate out the tithes because he's going to do that in a state of Torah, and he's going to give it to the appropriate people. Part of giving it to the appropriate people is that he himself has to keep himself tahor, and he has to give it to another chaver who's going to be able to safeguard it. And Amma Aretz can't do that. This is an Amma Aretz baker, and the rule that we're going to be seeing from Rabbi Yochanan is that if you're buying the tamei bread from the Amma Aretz, that all of the tithes are going to be done by the buyer, not by the seller. And why is that? Because it's already tamei. And what are you going to be doing with the parts that are going to have kedusha? Well, you're going to give it to the appropriate person, but it has to be burned. So really, it has to be destroyed. So the punchline is going to be that this is not by Bet Shammai, even though when you go through the reasoning, it's going to look like Bet Shammai. Really, the issue here is the allowance and the rule on this tamei bread is going to be anyway the tithes have to be burned. And anyway, what they're doing is they're saying that it's going to be the buyer who's going to be separating out the tithes, unlike the tahor bread that we learned earlier, where it's going to be the commercial baker who's going to take out the tithes. That, in a nutshell, is what is going to be happening, and that's going to keep it really easy to understand so you don't get confused. It took me a while to work on this before the shiur to work out what's going on, because it would look like, well, maybe the Mishnah should just be talking about Bet Hillel and everything. And really, this is dealing with another case. What happens when you really do have a commercial baker that's an Amma Aretz, and you really do have a case where the challah portion was not taken out because the Amma Aretz can't be trusted on tithes. And we know in the Torah, the challah is going to be called the first of your tithes, like truma. And it's very serious to eat bread without the challah portion being taken out. So somebody has to take out the portion. It's not going to be the Amma Aretz. it's going to be the buyer, even though this has to be burned. The Mishnah comes and says, one who buys bread from a baker, how does he tithe it? And the Mishnah says he takes and marks off a portion of the loaf sufficient for trumas, meiser, and challah. And he says 1/100th of what is here in the entire loaf, let it be meiser rishon on this side, on the marked off portion, and let the rest of the meiser rishon, basically another 9/100ths, be next to it in the unmarked off portion. Now, one of the things to keep in mind here, and this is going to be coming up at the end of the halacha, is going to be that this is not in order. Notice that he's taking out the challah, and this is coming right after trumas meiser. And ordinarily, you would say that, what should the order be? What should the order be for tithes? Where should the challah portion be going? So this challah portion is being put between the trumas meiser and the meiser rishon, or the meiser sheni. And that in itself is going to be an issue and interesting. And again, also the punchline is going to be that the challah is going to be, it's going to be where, anyway, the bread is tameh. That's going to be the issue. Now, normally you would want to separate out the challah portion as early as possible. Now you'd say, well, wait a second, but when you're smoothing out the grain pile, that's where you're going to take out your truma gedola, and ideally you would take out the meiser rishon and the trumas meiser, because the trumas meiser is also called the first of your tithes, and it has inside of it the ability to turn the grain pile into tevel if it's not properly taken out. But what we see here is that ideally the challah, which is also called the first of your tithes, this is going to be done when it's actually turned into dough, and we're going to see that ideally speaking, where this is talking about taking out challah, it's not exactly the ideal place when you would be dealing with something that would be definite tevel and definitely tahor and definitely in an ideal state where the grain that's growing out of the ground actually has the level of kedusha where it's going to be deraita, not derabanan, like after the ole bavel returned. So the Mishnah is now going to turn to the next portion, and it's going to say that 1/100th of the marked off portion that I initially made meiser rishon is hereby made trumas meiser for the meiser rishon, and the remainder of the mark off product is hereby made into challah. Now, one of the questions that we're talking about in terms of taking out challah is we see this in the Gemara in challah, that a private baker takes out 1/24 parts, and a commercial baker takes out 1/48 parts. So now that you have to be burning this and separating this, well, what do you take out? Do you take out the 1/24 parts, or do you take out the 1/48 parts? And the point about this is because this was made by a commercial baker, even in Am Haaretz, and even while it is tameh, you're going to take out the 1/48 parts. You're going to get that waiver. Why? Because he was supposed to take out 1/48, but he didn't. So instead of him taking it out, you take it out. It's not going to be like as if your wife baked it. It's going to be still like a commercial baker baked it. So it's still going to be 1/48. So the Mishnah is going to conclude, and it's going to say, and the meiser sheni that is in the northern side or the southern side of the bread is hereby deconsecrated onto the coins that I set up for this purpose. So he's going to designate 1/10 of what's left over of this loaf of bread as meiser sheni. And although he never actually is going to separate the meiser sheni from the loaf, any Meiser designation that you're going to specify in a particular part, in this particular location, to be Meiser, then basically you're going to deconsecrate that onto the coins and it's going to switch. So you will have the Meiser Sheni of Demai there on the coins. So one of the other parts about this is that Meiser Sheni money has to be taken to Jerusalem and used to purchase food that will be eaten there. But one of the things about Demai and Meiser Sheni of Demai is you don't need to worry about the redemption. So normal Meiser Sheni that's Doraita, normally you're going to have a 1/5 penalty for when you're going to bring it to Jerusalem, exchange it for money, and then re-exchange it back to food. You have to add, it's going to come up to 25%, even though it's called 1/5. And there's a penalty on that. But with the Meiser Sheni of Demai, you don't have that penalty. But in the Halacha, it's considered to be a burden to have to transport this money to Jerusalem and eat it there. It's inconvenient. So while it might not be a big deal to carry the money, it's an inconvenience. And so that's going to be considered a financial burden. So the Gemara is going to question the first ruling of the Mishnah. And the Mishnah implies that Meiser must be removed even from the challah portion of Demai produce. Now, the Vilna Goan is going to explain this like this. He's going to say that the language of the Mishnah, where it's going to say 1/100th of what is here, implies that the Meiser is being reckoned as 1/10 of the entire designated portion. That, by the way, is going to include the 1/48th that will become challah. And this implies that when the challah is separated from Demai, it too must be tithed. That's the implication. Now, the Gemara continues, and it says, but is challah subject to the law of Demai? And, of course, it's going to bring it back to what we learned. It says, did we not learn in a Mishnah over in chapter 1, halacha 3? So, my mistake, I said it was in chapter 2. This is actually chapter 1, halacha 3, where it says, the challah of an Amma Aretz and the meduma are exempt from the Demai tithing obligations. So, what we see over here from chapter 1, halacha 3, again, not chapter 2, is that the Mishnah's first ruling is saying explicitly that one does not need to tithe the challah portion of a dough that somebody gets from the Amma Aretz. The second ruling is not relevant here. That's saying that if truma fell into the Amma Aretz's food, the Goan who would give this mixture to eat can do it without tithing. But the Gemara here is asking, how can the Mishnah imply that someone must tithe the challah portion that comes from the Amma Aretz baker? Now, this, by the way, we saw as a dispute between Rabbi Hoshaya and Rabbi Yochanan as to why there is no requirement to separate tithes from challah that is purchased by an Amma Aretz. Over there, and we see this earlier in chapter 1, Rabbi Hoshaya is saying that it's because presumably all Amoratzim are going to tithe the challah, and challah is going to be sanctified, and in deference to its sanctity, all Amoratzim are going to be careful to separate out the required tithes. Now, I remember this debate over there in earlier in chapter 1 between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Hoshaya, and it doesn't mention the challah tithe by name. It just says that, according to Rabbi Hoshaya, all the tithes are taken out because they're going to respect the tithes. Rabbi Yochanan's point is going to be that only Truma Gadol is taken out at this time. They're not taking out the other tithes. So, according to Rabbi Hoshaya's explanation, it's going to follow that if the Amma Aretz himself never separated out the challah, but rather sold produce to a haver buyer who then separated out the challah himself, there'd be no grounds for the buyer to assume that the produce was tithed. So Rabbi Hoshaya is basically saying there's no contradiction between that Mishnah and this, because our Mishnah is speaking about where the challah was separated out by the buyer, one who buys from a baker. How does he tithe it? That's really what it's asking with Rabbi Hoshaya. So the Gemara's question is predicated on really Rabbi Yochanan's explanation of the Mishnah, and that anonymous Yerushalmi could be like Rabbi Yochanan's explanation. In other words, it's saying that Rabbi Yochanan was saying that the rabbis categorically excluded challah from the decree of Demai, and according to that explanation, this exemption is going to be for all cases, even to challah separated by a chaver from produce that he purchased from the Am Haaretz. So why, the question is, according to the Rosh, why does our Mishnah imply that the buyer must separate out Trumas Ma'aser even from the challah portion when the Mishnah in the first chapter is stating that challah is exempt from the Demai tithing obligation? And again, we're going to be getting into this idea of Rabbi Yochanan that this is going to be a rule of Demai, where you're buying temei bread, that all of the tithes are going to be done and left to the buyer, except for Truma Gedola. So the Gemara is going to ask a question, and because again, you could also say that this does look like the ruling of Bet Shammai. And it's not going to be the ruling of Bet Shammai, but it's going to look that way. And so here's how we're going to go through what Bet Shammai's ruling looks like. Rabbi Acha says in the name of Rabbi Ban Bar Chia, who says in the name of Rabbi Yosei ben Chanina, the Mishnah follows the opinion of Bet Shammai, who disputes the Mishnah and holds that challah is subject to Demai. And it was taught in a Brisa. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda says in the name of Rabbi Shimon, regarding challah, Bet Shammai obligates it in the Demai tithing obligation, whereas Bet Hillel exempts it. So this Brisa, by the way, can be found in the Tosefta in Demai 120, and the Vilna Goan says about this that whereas the Mishnah over there in chapter 1 Halacha 3 in Demai says categorically that Demai, that challah of an Am Haaretz is exempt from the Demai tithing obligation, the Brisa is teaching that, in fact, this is only the opinion of Bet Hillel, and Bet Shammai is holding that an Am Haaretz's challah is subject to Demai. And so the Gemara would answer that our Mishnah is going to accord with Bet Shammai. In other words, according to this reading, the Mishnah over there is according to Bet Hillel's reading, and the Mishnah over here is according to Bet Shammai. Now, the Gemara is going to object to that. And it's going to say, but did Bet Shammai say anything other than something that is purchased for consumption is subject to Demai? In other words, the Vilna Goan is going to be explaining it like this. He's going to be saying that that basically this is going to be where you're buying your wares from the baker, and it's assuming that the baker is an Am Haaretz, because if he is a chaver, he wouldn't need to be doing these tithes. And Bet Shammai is basically saying in the Brisa that challah is obligated in Demai. They're going to be discussing tahor challah, but challah that's purchased from an Am Haaretz is presumed to be tamei, and this challah, even by Bet Shammai, is exempt from tithing, not because it's challah, but because it's considered to be inedible, and you have to burn it. This product is something that's purchased for animals, or it's purchased for burning. It's not purchased for human consumption, explains the Vilna Goan. So he's actually saying that in the case that the produce itself is going to be purchased for human consumption, since even tamei produce can be edible in certain circumstances, nevertheless, since the buyer knows that the challah portion that he will need to separate from the produce ultimately has to be burned, it's considered as if he purchased something that is not for human consumption. Now, that's going to be a deep point here. Now, we know that food gets susceptible to tuma when it gets moistened with water, wine, bees' honey, olive oil, milk, dew, and blood. These are the 7 liquids. Now, bread, when you're going to make dough from water, is going to be susceptible. So, when Bet Shammai is saying that you're buying something and you have to tithe it, he's talking about something that is for human consumption. And we know that if you're buying for animal food, you don't need to tithe Demai. We're talking about something that is fit for consumption. But that's very curious because we know that, even in Bet Shammai's formulation, that if you're buying from a baker who's an Alma Aretz and the merchandise is going to be considered to be Demai, even Bet Shammai would agree that its challah is exempt from tithing, and since Demai challah is unfit for consumption, then you don't need to tithe it. So what's going on here? So the Gemara is going to give a resolution to this, and this is not going to be the final resolution, but it's going to give a suggestion. It's going to say, rather, this mission is dealing with where the baker needs the dough from fruit juice. And why would that be? Because dough is not susceptible to tuma when it's done with fruit juice. And so then the challah that's taken out for it would be fit for consumption. And that is the explanation for how Bet Shammai could obligate this tithe. But that's a big question because, wait a second, when you think about going to the kosher pizza place and eating the pizza that's mezonot, why? Because they mixed it with some fruit juice, and that makes it so you don't have to do challah. You don't have to say chamotzi. So the Gemara is saying like that. It's going to say, but did Rabbi Yosef, son of Rabbi Hanina, not say regarding a mission in challah, which including bread needed from fruit juice in the challah obligation? Now, where is that over there? That's going to be the view of Rabbi Elazar ben Yehuda of Bertosa. Now, the Gemara, this by the way is in the Yerushalmi 2:1, and over there it's teaching that dough that's needed with fruit juice is subject to challah. That's not the halacha. That's only the tradition and a minority view of Rabbi Elazar ben Yehuda of Bertosa. And he's holding that fruit juice is going to be considered like water in that it binds together the dough into a cohesive unit for tuma. That's not the halacha. So the question that comes up is, well, can't we say that our Mishnah, which obligates the bread and challah, would be also referring to bread needed with fruit juice? So that really can't be because they're ruling not like the minority view over there in Challah 2:1. They're ruling that it's water. Water makes bread that becomes subject to tuma when you make it into a dough, not fruit juice. So the fruit juice needed challah or pizza, you don't need to make chamotzi on. So because it's not with the obligation of challah and everything else, it's going to be a different set of brachas as well. The Gemara is going to give a different explanation for how the Mishnah's ruling can be obligating even the challah portion of Demai by resolving it by saying it's like Bet Shammai. So the Gemara says, rather, if we wish to resolve this difficulty by attributing this Mishnah to Bet Shammai, the Mishnah should not be understood as Rabbi Yochanan explains it. Why? Because Rabbi Yochanan says in this Gemara here, in the second chapter, the Mishnah refers to where he makes the dough in a state of Torah. Whereas here, in the 5th chapter, that's going to be here, with us talking about this in chapter 5, Halacha 1 of Demai, he makes the dough in a state of Tuma. And that's really the deep point. According to this explanation of Rabbi Yochanan, we can't resolve the question of why our Mishnah obligates even the challah portion in tithing by saying this Mishnah follows Bet Shammai. And effectively, Rabbi Yochanan is saying it doesn't follow Bet Shammai. That's not Bet Shammai's opinion. And really, why are you separating out challah from it? Not because it's like Bet Shammai saying that you can separate out challah from Demai. It's because there's a rabbinic rule that you're assuming that the Amma Aretz baker never separated out the challah portion at all because he's an Amma Aretz. And also they're only separating out Truma Gedola, and they're not separating out the other tithes, including challah. And even if he were separating out the other tithes, it's going to be Demai anyway. So they're putting this burden on the buyer to do it. And so you have to separate it out. And yes, it's not really food. You have to take it to be burned. You have to give it to the Kohen who's going to burn it. And so that's really what it's saying. In other words, if you want to understand this as like Bet Shammai, you can't use Rabbi Yochanan's explanation. Rabbi Yochanan's explanation doesn't work. And if you want to keep to to Bet Shammai's explanation, you're going to have to use a slightly different logic. And the Gemara is going to try to look at it with Bet Shammai. And, Bet Shammai is going to obligate challah in Demai. And they're going to agree that produce for the purposes other than consumption is going to be exempt from Demai. But over here, Rabbi Yochanan is going to explain this Mishnah to be discussing a baker who bakes his bread in Tuma. And Bet Shammai would even agree that the bread's challah portion, which is inedible, is going to be exempt from Demai. So how do you resolve this if you want to make it where this is going to be like Bet Shammai? The Gemara is going to say, rather, if we wish to answer this by attributing our Mishnah to Bet Shammai, we have to explain it as Rabbi Elazar did. In other words, Rabbi Elazar says, here and here, both in our Mishnah and the Mishnah in the second chapter, this is going to be in Challah, the Tana is referring to where he makes the dough in a state of Torah. And since our Mishnah is discussing bread that is tahor, its challah portion is going to be edible. And then it's going to be obligated in tithing according to Bet Shammai. In other words, the only way you can make this work for Bet Shammai saying that you're separating out challah from Demai is where it's going to be tahor. And according to Bet Shammai, if the challah portion is tahor and it's Demai, you would separate it out according to Bet Shammai. According to Bet Hillel, they're going to say that you're not going to separate out the challah from it, and anyway, that is going to be as if you want to explain that by Bet Shammai's reasoning. But what we're seeing here is that it's perfectly possible and reasonable to be explaining this with Rabbi Yochanan's explanation, which is that this is going to be a rabbinic situation that the buyer has to separate it out because anyway the bread is assumed to not have had all of the tithes taken out, and it's Demai because an Amma Aretz baker can't do things about Demai and Tahor except to make things Demai, and you have to burn it. And so it's really like not food. So we're going to get more into this. And, if our Mishnah is talking about bread that is going to be Tahor, okay, then it's going to be dealing with a baker who is going to be trusted to produce bread in Torah. And if that's the case, you're talking about a haver who is able to do something that's going to be tahor, then it's really not going to be demai because he's going to take out the tithes. And the rule is that a person who is trusted on tahoros, by the way, is going to be trusted on tithes. We've covered this already. So the Mishnah is going to be stated that the buyer must tithe the bread. So how do you do this? Okay, in other words, we were trying to explain this and understand this by Bet Shammai's ruling. But again, if you're assuming that the bread is tahor, how is it tahor? Because if you're making it with a haver, he's tithing it anyway, and it's tahor, and then it's not demai. So what are we doing here? So the Gemara is going to try to do this other point. How did you get to have tahor bread here? So as a rule, that a person, who is trusted for tahoros is trusted for tithes. That says the Gemara is stated specifically for a case in which one is hosted and the trusted person is going to be the guest. And the guest can be lenient and eat the trusted person's food without tithing it. But people to whom the trusted person sells the food may not assume that is tithe. So over there, we're talking about if somebody's a guest. What about if you're making a purchase, like from a baker? So the Gemara is going to say, or the Brisa teaches that one who is trusted regarding Tohoros is trusted regarding Maisros. And Rabbi Yanai, the son of Rabbi Yishmael, taught this Brisa and said, in explanation thereof, that this was stated only regarding someone who is hosted by the trusted person. But in public, the trusted person is not tithed until he commits to the laws of Maisros in public. In other words, they have to make this public declaration, they have to go to the Bet Din, and they have to make a claim not only to do things in Taharos, but to separate out the tithes properly. Otherwise, even if it's a Torah scholar, they're not trusted. You have to make a physical, personal declaration with witnesses. The Gemara says, and thus there's no question from here in this Mishnah that we're dealing with a baker who is selling to the public. This again is going to be a commercial baker. And so even though the baker is going to be trusted for Tohoros, his customers must tithe that purchase. The Gemara now is going to give a different answer to this contradiction between our Mishnah and the Mishnah in the first chapter. That's going to exempt Challah of Demai. So we're going to try to come up with a different way to understand this Mishnah. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Avin quoted Rabbi Shammai, who says in the name of Rabbi Acha, learn the answer from the next Mishnah. In other words, the Mishnah that's going to be coming up in chapter 5, Halacha 2. And the Gemara is going to say that Mishnah that's coming up states, one who wishes to separate Truma and Trumas Meiser at one time, just as there you say that the Mishnah means 1/100th of what is here, besides what is fit to be sanctified for the sake of Truma. So to here, in our Mishnah, the statement 1/100th of what is here means 1/100th of what is here besides what is fit to be sanctified for the sake of Challah. So in other words, because the Challah portion is exempt from Demai, the idea is that the Gemara is presenting two fundamentally different interpretations of what our Mishnah requires the buyer to do. One is going to be to separate tithes from the entire loaf that he purchased, and two is going to be to separate tithes only from the portion of the loaf that will be left after Challah is removed. So the Gemara is going to explain this section of the Mishnah that describes the procedure for tithing the Demai bread. And the Gemara is going to ask a question. It's going to say, the Mishnah mentions Challah between Meiser Rishon and Meiser Sheni. And that, as I pointed out, is very curious. So the Mishnah gives the order of the separation of gifts here from this purchased Demai bread as being Meiser Rishon, then Challah, then Meiser Sheni. But Scripture calls Challah Truma, and Challah should be removed before Meiser Rishon because the idea is that you don't delay on gifts, and you don't delay on mitzvahs, and you don't take the separation out of order. And the Challah is called something different. It's called Truma, and Truma is called first. That's going to be the idea. So the Gemara is going to give two answers to this question, and we're going to be finishing this up soon. So the first is Rabbi Yonah says in the name of Rabbi Zera, this tells us that Challah is not subject to the prohibition of not to delay. In other words, not to tamper with the order of separations. Generally speaking, you have to do tithes in order, and that's going to be the biblical commandment not to delay. And they're saying here, this is showing that with Challah, that perhaps this can be done out of order. Why could that be? Well, because Challah comes when you make the dough. And what happens if you were at the threshing floor and you separated out your Truma Gedola and then you did your other tithes, and then you purchased grain that already had the tithes taken out, and then you're going home to make the dough? well, that would be out of order. So this is teaching us that the challah portion could be made out of order. The second answer is going to be that in the name of Rabbi Zera, the Mishnah was not stated in order. That's a big hiddush. In other words, it's saying that challah really is supposed to be separated before Meiser Rishon. And this Gemara is going to question this order, and it's going to challenge this. So the Gemara is going to say, but are we not dealing with Demai? And the Gemara continues, says, did Rabbi Ba, the son of Rabbi Hia, not say in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that our Mishnah is dealing with Demai, implying that we're not dealing with definite tevel? And the Gemara says, and since we're dealing with Demai, and you have no question because the requirement to separate the tithes is going to be in a specific order, and that's not going to apply to Demai. Now, this is pointing out that we're talking about where it's not definite tevel, and Truma Gadol has been definitely separated out. And what they're saying is that, look, first of all, this is going to be Demai, and that order is going to be treated leniently because it's Demai, and that's going to be D'Rabbanan. And second of all, you're dealing with bread that's Tamei anyway. And so, anyway, part of it has to be burnt and destroyed. So, keep in mind that, the order here is not like you're dealing with definite tevel. Definite tevel, all of this would be true. But we're dealing with Demai. That's the point of what Rabbi Ba, the son of Rabbi He, is pointing out. And by the way, this is in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. That, if we were dealing with definite tevel, that would all be true. It has to be done in order. But Demai doesn't have that. And also, the bread is Tamei. And, part of it has to be burnt. So if you're taking it out of order, and anyway, part of it has to be burnt anyway, whatever. It's not, and anyway, it's Demai, and that's D'Rabbanan, and it's not definite tevel. In the case of it being definite tevel, even Rabbi Yochanan would agree it has to be done in order. But we're learning something about Demai, that if the tithes were done out of order, it's not the end of the world, and what's done is done. The Gemara is going to answer, Rabbi Chia taught in a brisa, according to which, this is going to be the ruling of our Mishnah, that the separation of Meiser Rishon is going to precede Challah, and that was stated even with regard to definite tevel. So this Tosefet is teaching that, in order to rectify bread that's definite tevel, and in that Tosefet as well, it's saying Meiser Rishon is going to be mentioned before Challah. And so we could see that, even in definite tevel, Meiser Rishon would precede Challah. Keep in mind, Challah is always going to be a case where you have to do it from your dough, and you have to add water to it. So, you have a case of where is the grain being, having tithes separated out from, and where are you getting the flour so that you can make it into dough. So, again, when you're doing this idea of doing it in order, that's going to be for definite tevel, for sure. But we're seeing here something a little bit different for challah. And part of that is going to be because challah is when the dough is made. So the Gemara says, and it was, the Gemara is going to be talking about the brisa, and it's going to be saying that Rabbi Yonah stated in the name of Rabbi Zera that this Mishnah teaches us that challah is not subject to the prohibition of not to delay. And with the answer, Rabbi Yosef stating in the name of Rabbi Zera, and the Mishnah was not stated in order. Rather, the separation of challah must precede that of Meiser Rishon. So we're trying to answer, why does challah not precede Meiser Rishon? And, what's going on? So the Gemara is going to challenge Rabbi Yosef's position that the separation of challah is supposed to precede that of Meiser Rishon. Because again, how exactly do you do that if it's supposed to be from the dough? So the Gemara is going to say, if so, challah should not be subject to tithes, but the tithes should be subject to challah. For we have a rule regarding any of the obligations that precedes its counterpart in the order of obligations, and that its counterpart is going to be subject to it. It's not going to be subject to its counterpart. So what this is really saying is that, when you're having gifts like truma, and that's supposed to be separated for meiser, then no extra meiser is supposed to be set aside to cover the amount that's previously removed from truma. And over here, according to Rabbi Yosei, in the case in which maestros was not yet separated from bread, challah is supposed to be separated for the maestros, and the challah should be exempt from the maestros. But that's not true, because the challah is, it's only true in the case of challah of Demai, where challah of Demai would be exempt from tithing, and that's going to imply that the challah of definite tevel is still going to be subject to tithing. So again, challah of Demai and challah of definite tevel is going to be two different things. And the Gemara is going to defend Rabbi Yossi's point, and then we're going to finish up the Gemara. And the Gemara says, but it was taught in this brisa, one who makes dough from tevel, whether he advanced the separation of challah ahead of the separation of truma, or he advanced the separation of truma ahead of the separation of challah, what he has done, he has done. And what this is saying is, although truma is supposed to be separated first, nevertheless, if you reverse the order, his separation is still going to be effective. Now, dough is normally made from hulin, and since trumas and meiser are going to be ordinarily separated when the produce is in the kernel stage, by the time the challah obligation takes effect, that's going to be when the kernel is ground into flour, and it's going to be turned into a dough. And in this case, the brisa is talking about a person who's making a dough from tevel, and in that case, you can have both truma and challah being, having to be separated from the dough. But normally, that's not normally the case. People don't normally take all of the kernels, do no separations, turn it into flour that's tevel, and then make a dough out of it. You can do it, but that's not normally how it's done. Normally, at the threshing floor, they're doing the tithes, and part of why they're doing the tithes right away is this not to delay, because a lot of times the Kohanim historically would go to the area where the threshing floor was and demand their tithes. And so you would have to tithe it right away and give it. So the Gemara is going to continue with this, and and it's going to say, and to try to defend Rabbi Yossi's point, it's going to say that in the former case, the challah may not be eaten until he takes out truma for it. And in the later case, the truma may not be eaten until he separates challah for it. So we can see that there's an obligation which should have been done earlier, but it was not done until the later obligation takes effect. In other words, they took the kernels and they turned it into flour. They didn't do any of the tithes, and then they made it into a dough. So over here, in our case, where the meiser obligation should have been discharged while the grain is still going to be in a kernel form, and it was not done until the challah obligation takes effect, when it's basically turned into a dough, now you can have both obligations apply, and you can take out truma and meiser rishon and challah, because you have a case where none of the tithes were done at the threshing floor. So that's not really normally how it's going to be done. The Gemara is going to go back to the position of Rabbi Yonah that the biblical prohibition of not to delay is not going to apply to challah at all. And again, one of the things is that we're seeing it's not really going to be like Rabbi Yosei, where you're talking about a case where, yeah, sure, you can do all the tithes when it's going to be the dough if nothing was separated at the threshing floor and you're dealing with dough that's definite tevel. Sure, you can take out the tithes then. But what Rabbi Yonah's point is saying, no, but assume that the Truma Gedola and all the other tithes are done at the threshing floor. The appropriate people came and claimed their portion over there at the threshing floor. Now you have flour that, is going to be chulin, and now you're talking about the order. Is challah going to be separated first or not? So the Gemara is going to say, and why does Meiser Rishon precede challah? In other words, shouldn't challah be separated first? The Gemara is going to answer. Meiser Rishon is separated first because it takes effect first at the threshing floor. In other words, challah takes effect later when the flour is made into dough. And over there, where the Levim are coming to collect their portion, and there's Kohanim over there as well, and they're collecting their portion, and the Levim collect the Meiser Rishon, and the Levim see the Kohanim there, and they take out the Trumas Meiser from their portion, the Meiser Rishon, and they give it to the Kohen that's over there, and everything has been rectified. That's what we're talking about. The Gemara is going to counter this. To say, but Meiser Sheni also precedes the challah obligation at the threshing floor. So why then does our Mishnah over here teach that challah is separated before Meiser Sheni? And again, this is going to go back toward Rabbi Yochanan's position. So yeah, normally you're going to take out the Meiser Sheni even at the threshing floor as well. The Gemara is going to answer. Rabbi Matanya says, by rights, challah should precede everything else. And why does Meiser Rishon precede it? Because it both preceded the challah obligation at the threshing floor, and also because the term first is written concerning it. And regarding the Meiser Sheni, however, even though it precedes the challah obligation at the threshing floor, the term first is not written concerning it. So even though Meiser Sheni has the advantage over challah that the obligation precedes it because it's done over at the threshing floor, Scripture is still calling the challah first. And so it would look like the Scripture is still giving some sort of precedence to it. Now, Meiser Rishon, that's still going to contain within it the Truma Meiser. And also, by the way, the Truma is still going to be called first in the Torah. This you can see in Numbers 18:12 and Devarim 18:4. And since both of them are going to be called first, and challah is also going to be separated first, you'd say, oh, well, maybe challah has to be separated first. But let's go back a step, because the Gemara just answers it and ends, and I think we need to explain a little bit. We're talking about Meiser Sheni we're talking about Meiser bread that's going to be Demai. And this Meiser Sheni is going to be Meiser Sheni of Demai. And all of these tithes are going to be Meiser Rishon of Demai. And anyway, the Meiser Rishon of Demai, the Levi can't prove, and you get to keep it. And if you want to sell it to the Levim, you can, but you can keep it because they can't prove it. Maybe it was already taken out. And over here, we're dealing with something that's inedible. This bread is temeh, and the challah portion has to be given to the kohen when it is tahor. And if you give it to the kohen when it's temeh, he has to burn it. It's inedible. And you still have to give it to the kohen while it's temeh to let him burn it and fuel his oven, get some heat out of it. But it's done, right? And so anyway, what Rabbi Yochanan's point, what is really pointing to is this is not like Bet Shammai. And really what we're seeing is that, yes, you have to do these things in order. And yes, challah is called first, but there's a waiver anyway on challah because all of these things can be tied at the threshing floor, and challah comes about later when you're making dough. So if you were to do this first, how would you would end up where you would have, flour that's going to be tevel because you wouldn't have any ties, and it's not done that way. The kohen gets the right to come to the threshing floor and ask. And normally the practice is going to be when the kohen is asking for his tithes, normally people are going to give it to him. And when the Levi is asking, people are normally going to give it to him as well. They're not really going to take flour and turn it into tevel flour. So we're not really dealing with that. We're really dealing with a case where, anyway, first of all, challah is going to be out of order. Yes, it's called the first, but again, it's when it's turned into dough. And, the other tithes, even Meiser Sheni, which is not called the first, is normally going to be done at the threshing floor. And when you're looking at this Mishnah, why is this out of order? Why is Meiser Sheni coming after the challah portion? So anyway, Rabbi Yochanan would be saying, anyway, this is the Am Haaretz who made this bread. And anyway, the rabbis are saying with bread of Demai from a commercial baker that is going to be an Am Haaretz, that you're going to separate out the tithes, and it's the buyer who separates out all the tithes, and it's not going to be the seller. Normally with a haver, it's going to be the seller who separates the tithes. But over here, it's tamei, and a lot of these parts are inedible, and a lot of these parts have to be burnt. And so even the Truma Meiser that gets taken out, that ultimately has to go to a Kohen, that also, by the way, has a problem. It's also tamei. And, if you're taking out, parts of the bread that, are going to be tamei, that ultimately are going to be burned, they're not considered edible. And so, you can be lax on the separation in terms of the order, because anyway it's inedible, anyway it's tamei, anyway it's got to be burnt. And that's really the deeper point here. It's not really like, a thing of fruit juice and, somehow this baker was able to keep everything tahor, like some implication about something with Bet Shammai. It's not. This is really like Rabbi Yochanan, and it's really where, this is going to be a rabbinic thing where, anyway you're dealing with bread of Demai, anyway it's tamei, anyway it's going to be a rabbinic thing that the buyer is responsible for doing the tithes. And if the tithes are out of order from the tevel obligation, where if this was going to be definite tevel and definite tevel bread, and you had to take out all the tithes in the state of Torah, that would be one thing. But it's Demai bread, and Demai bread anyway is going to be lenient, and anyway the parts that have Kedusha have to be burnt. Have a great day.